Whenever you make a sound inside an ordinary room, it reverberates back to you. That's simply a basic principle of physics, yet there is a psychological parallel to this phenomenon that most people never consciously recognize. A child reaches out emotionally because they expect something in return. Not always language. Sometimes it's as simple as a look or a gentle touch, a barely noticeable shift in someone's expression that quietly communicates, I see you, you exist. But when nothing returns, when the sound dissolves and vanishes into silence, the child doesn't assume the room is flawed. Children don't reason that way. Instead, they decide that the sound itself wasn't worth echoing. That is where it starts. For decades, psychology has framed trauma as something that happens to a person, something concrete you could point at and say, that's it, that's where it occurred. A car accident, an assault, an event with a clearly defined before and after, and for many individuals, that framework makes sense. But it has also left an entire category of suffering unnamed and largely misunderstood. From the outside, it may not resemble trauma at all. The house remained intact. The parents were physically present. No one is going to publish a memoir about the birthday that quietly passed without anyone remembering, or about the afternoon they sat in their room crying for an hour while no one checked in, about watching their mother's gaze drift away each time they tried to share something that felt important to them. The events that never took place don't seem to qualify as significant. It's difficult to explain these experiences without worrying that you sound overly dramatic, and yet they leave traces, subtle, steady, and enduring. Their invisibility does not make them unreal. Psychologists refer to this pattern as childhood emotional neglect, and part of the reason it remained understudied for so long lies in its very nature. It is defined not by what happened, but by what repeatedly failed to happen, the emotional attunement that never arrived, the mirroring that was consistently absent. Beneath this lies a fundamental developmental truth. Children come to understand their internal world much the same way they acquire language, through having it reflected back to them. When a caregiver says, "You seem sad right now," am I right? They are doing something deeply formative. They are teaching the child that inner experiences exist, that those experiences can be named, that they are important enough to be noticed. If that reflection never occurs or happens so infrequently that it barely registers, the child may grow into an adult who is sincerely, sometimes bewilderingly, unable to identify what they are feeling. There is a clinical term for this, alexithymia. It refers to difficulty recognizing and articulating one's own emotional states. Research has repeatedly shown higher rates of alexithymia among individuals who experience emotional neglect in childhood. It is not simply a personality trait. It is a void shaped by what was missing. Imagine living your entire life in a room where no sound ever comes back to you, and then being told, just speak louder. What this dynamic often creates in adulthood is a pattern that clinicians recognize immediately, yet the individuals themselves struggle to make sense of. These people are frequently high functioning, capable, dependable, the sort of person everyone assumes is doing well, because on the surface, they appear to be. They appear fine because appearing fine became the survival strategy they mastered so early in life that they no longer remember acquiring it. Dr. Jenny Webb, the clinician who first gave childhood emotional neglect a formal definition, often describes clients who don't arrive with a specific concrete complaint. Instead, they speak about a lingering, hard to define sense that something is off. A quiet but persistent feeling that everyone else seems able to access an emotional wavelength they simply can't tune into. It isn't quite depression. It doesn't fully match textbook anxiety either. It's closer to a kind of emotional dullness, as though life is being lived from behind a pane of glass. And relationships, this is often where the pain becomes most visible, because someone who grew up feeling unseen doesn't just struggle to connect. They frequently disrupt the connection at the very moment it begins to feel genuine, For instance, when someone offers them a sincere compliment, they immediately deflect it or laugh it away. Or when a partner loves them steadily and without conditions, that steadiness can feel oddly suffocating instead of comforting, almost unsafe, as if you're bracing for it to disappear, and that reaction makes perfect sense. If love felt inconsistent or unreliable during childhood, you would have learned eventually to stop depending on it. So you adapted. You became fiercely self sufficient, the one who needs no one, the one who has everything under control and is perfectly capable alone. From the outside, that can look like strength, but more often, it's simply an old coping pattern that once kept you protected. The longing for closeness didn't vanish. It was buried so deeply that even you stopped sensing it. Needs don't evaporate. When they discover that making noise changes nothing, they simply grow quiet. A 2024 scoping review published in Child Abuse and Neglect, which examined 25 different studies, found consistent evidence that adults who experience neglect in childhood face substantial challenges with emotional regulation. The researchers also noted that emotional neglect remains one of the least examined forms of childhood adversity, which in itself says a great deal. The injury that leaves the faintest visible trace is often the one we've invested the least effort in understanding. Here's what truly matters, and I'll say it plainly. The behaviors you developed were not mistakes, they were solutions. Intelligent, remarkably adaptive responses to an environment that required you to shrink yourself, to ask for less, to expect less. The child who became quiet learned that silence reduced risk. The child who became funny discovered that humor was the most dependable way to be noticed. Others threw themselves into academics. Some became caretakers long before they should have had to. And some, heartbreakingly, learned to fade into the background altogether. They relied heavily on whatever tools were available, and they used them skillfully. The difficulty is that coping strategies don't automatically retire themselves once they're no longer necessary. You may no longer be in that silent room, but your nervous system hasn't entirely updated the map. It still tenses when someone gets too close. It still feels unsettled when someone is consistently kind. You may still struggle to identify your own emotions as though you're trying to hear something muffled behind a thick wall. The hopeful part is that this isn't fixed forever. The brain retains a remarkable capacity for change, even after a painful start. And therapy specifically attuned to this experience can have a meaningful impact. This isn't meant to tie everything up neatly, because the reality is more complex than that. Healing here tends to be gradual, and it often involves grieving something unusual, the absence of what should have existed. How do you mourn what never took place? How do you process a feeling that isn't attached to a single clear memory? It usually requires patience, persistence, and often the presence of someone who can help. But the beginning is smaller and more personal than therapy alone. It starts with deciding that your own experience deserves to be taken seriously. The fact that no one showed up for you at certain moments does not mean you were undeserving of being shown up for. You always were. And in daily life, this looks far less dramatic than you might imagine. It doesn't require a sweeping emotional breakthrough. It can start with noticing that you're angry and, instead of immediately suppressing it or telling yourself you're exaggerating, simply allowing it to exist for a moment. It might mean catching yourself dismissing a compliment and pausing long enough to ask why. Small acts of paying attention to your inner world, actions that seem minor until you recognize that some people were never taught that their inner world mattered at all. This kind of change doesn't happen overnight, but each time you check in with yourself honestly, something shifts, even if only slightly. For someone who grew up feeling unheard, learning to listen inward may be the central task. There's a particular kind of person who ends up watching something like this. It's late at night, they're scrolling, and they stumble across the words emotional neglect, and something inside them tightens, a quiet recognition, an uncomfortable familiarity. If that's happening for you right now, pay attention to it. Giving something a name doesn't magically resolve it, But that moment of recognition is your nervous system doing something it may never have been taught to do well. It's creating its own echo, maybe faint, but present. The sound was always worthy of being heard. It simply needed a different room. And if this spoke to you, if it gave language to something you've been carrying quietly for a long time, subscribing would genuinely mean a lot. I create these in-depth explorations regularly, and there's much more to unpack. There's also a join button on the channel if you'd ever like to directly support this work. Take a look at the other videos on your screen. I have a feeling you might recognize yourself in them. I'll see you there.